here, Philip Lesenkoff and Jim Balsiger. We are also joined by our third commissioner from the U.S. side, Ralph Horde, who's on the telephone calling in from Hawaii. From the Canadian side, we have Michael Pearson, currently an IPHC commissioner. We have Laura Richards, recently retired IPHC commissioner, but still very much active in this process. We have our colleagues from CONCUR, Scott McCreary and Bennett Brooks. Many of you met them at the last annual meeting and in fact did interviews as part of their performance review. We also have the senior staff here from the IPHC, Bruce Lehman and his staff, and our friend Dr. Lily Lowe from NOAA Fisheries is here in the offices. We have John Pollard from NOAA General Counsel also here helping us do the webinar today. Those of you who registered for the webinar should have seen an agenda for what we're going to cover today. I just wanted to summarize where we'll be headed in the next couple hours. We'll walk through the sort of background and scene setting. I'll come back to that and how we got to today's rollout of the performance review. I will then turn it over to Scott and Bennett from CONCUR to touch on the highlights of the final report, to discuss their findings and recommendations. We will then open it up for questions and answers. I wanted to be clear that today's webinar and that question and answer session really should be, I think, the most constructive way to look at it is using that question and answer session to ask clarifying questions about the final report. In other words, try to understand the methodology that Scott and Bennett used, perhaps get clarity around some of their findings and their recommendations. In terms of a longer or more robust public comment period where you can, if you wish to offer your opinions, to make editorial comments about the report, I wanted to be clear that that will be available to you in a longer public comment period that will open today and run through June 30th. Any comments that are submitted via the webinar today will be collected and saved, including all the questions that you ask, any comments that you'd submit. But I just wanted to be clear that this is really just the beginning of the public consultation process, not the end. We will then, after the question and answer session, we will then turn the floor back to our commissioners, where they will be able to offer their final comments and map out for you next steps in the process. It might be helpful to give those of you who are new to the performance review process a little background on how we got here. At the 2011 annual meeting, in January of 2011, the Commission decided to move ahead with this performance review to look at how it does business, how transparent of a process it is, how efficient of a process the IPHC meeting cycle is. And to do that, the Commission decided to contract with a third-party consultant. As part of that, the lead into that process, the Commission named a two-person steering committee with myself and Allison Webb, who I already mentioned, to help lay out the terms of reference for the performance review, to solicit bids from external consultants, and ultimately to choose CONCUR, who's with us today. Oops. I also wanted to highlight that this performance review was really undertaken in the context of a broader international mandate to look at the performance of the Commission. Multiple international fisheries organizations are doing these reviews, and this fits in nicely with that process. We have today, we have approximately 50 people registered for the webinar. Those of you who ultimately will submit questions to the process cannot see the questions that that others are submitting. Therefore, Allison and I will be reading those out loud as they come in. We'll be paraphrasing them for the room. We will be trying to group those questions by topic. So even though your exact question might not be read out specifically as you submit it, we hope to capture everyone's questions as part of that grouping exercise. I'm trying to think if I skipped over anything else in terms of background. I don't think so. With that, let me. Oh, right. I guess before turning it over to Scott and Bennett, I wanted to, at the end of the day, I wanted to thank those of you who have taken the time both to participate in today's webinar, but also those of you who gave your time and effort to be interviewed by CONCUR over the last several months. Reflected substantial amount of input from a number of interested stakeholders and user groups, and without your participation, without your input, the report would not have been as excellent as it is. With that, let me turn it over to Scott and Bennett from CONCUR to start their presentation, and I'll come back to you to launch to the public to launch the question and answer session after you're done.
Excellent, John. Thanks very much. And let me echo John's expression of thanks to all the stakeholders who took part in the process and who, without whom we would not have had the opportunity to gain the insights we have about the Commission. Let me take a moment to just walk through. Let me take a moment, if I could, just to walk through the format of our presentation today. What we're going to do is to begin with a little bit of background about our purpose and objectives. We'll tell you about our report methodology, and then really the core is our findings, strengths first, and then some of the challenges we encountered, and then we'll look at stakeholder suggestions for moving forward. Those were very influential in helping us craft our recommendations, which really are informed suggestions. And moving on to next steps is the way that we'll wrap up our presentation. So the purpose of the review was to undertake an independent review. We stress that we are, while we are certainly working closely and working alongside the staff and the commissioners, this is a fully independent review, and we have full authority to conduct interviews and reach our own conclusions. As John Field just said, this is part of an ongoing international practice to assess regional fishery management organizations. Our time frame, for the most part, was a look over the last 10 years. The specific objectives that we tackled were to assess the recent performance of the Commission relative to the goals stepped out in the treaty, to highlight and identify effective practices, and also to underscore opportunities to further strengthen how the Commission goes about its work. And in particular, we looked at opportunities to strengthen the Commission's governance arrangements. The methods that we used are, as we described at the annual meeting, for those of you who were there and heard us outline our approach, really core to this was a set of 43 in-depth stakeholder interviews. These were conducted with a broad-based set of players and organizations and interests concerned with the work of the Commission. We also observed the Commission meeting in detail, both the annual meeting and the interim meetings. We delved into documents in considerable detail, and we took a look at best practices not only in other regional fishery management organizations, but also other organizations involved in fishery management and stakeholder engagement in natural resources management. The interviews we conducted were confidential. Our practice was to summarize the interviews, and we actually prepared a summary for each one, sent it back to each of the interviewees individually to confirm that we recorded the views accurately. Now, importantly, the interviews are not meant to be a census. We felt strongly that we could do a strong representative sample with the 43 that we did. We were informed by our experience that shows that doing a much larger set of interviews probably would not materially change the findings, and we are confident that we have a good grip on the range of views out there. Our work was independent of commissioners and staff, and I want to very much stress that any actions that flow from this report are very much dependent on action by the Commission. Bennett and I are not empowered to act as special masters. We can't mandate any suggestions, but as I said, these recommendations we present are our informed suggestions. Bennett.
So this is Bennett here, and I'm glad to have you all online. At this point, we want to dive into the findings, but before we really walk through some of the more specific findings, I'd like to hit some of the big picture themes that came up. And at first, what I think will be helpful is just to share a couple of quotes that we heard in some of these interviews. And the first one, for those of you who don't have access to the computer to see the webinar, the first one says, "This is a very strong and well-respected process." That's a quote from a current commissioner. The next quote is, "We need to refocus and re-engage an industry member." Quote, "I think there's been a little bit of every one of us riding on our laurels." That came from a government agency official. Quote, "It's a 19th century model that's not been allowed to evolve using present-day processes." That was from a tribal First Nations representative. And lastly, from a current commissioner, "It's in all of our interest that we have a working commission that's respected." These 5 quotes, we think, do a pretty good job of encapsulating in many ways, some of the broadest themes we heard, which really focused around, first of all, that there is respect for and strength in the Commission's current work. We heard loud and clear that there is much about the Commission that is effective and that is working and that is very well respected around the table. The second broad theme was the need and the opportunity to strengthen and adapt to changing circumstances. We do not live in a static world. The issues that the Commission faces are not static, and there's a recognition that there may be a need to adapt. And thirdly, that there's interest and importance in working together. People want to see the Commission be as strong as it can, and they're interested in working together, working with the commissioners, working with staff to further that aim. So broadly, our findings were threefold. The first was that for decades, the Commission has managed Pacific halibut resource to great success. We heard loud and clear, again, particularly looking back over a sweep of history, that people think the Commission has done a very solid job, and the stakeholders are committed to and supportive of the Commission and its work. The second broad finding, however, tended to focus around a growing concern that the past approaches and the processes are no longer as effective as they once were. Again, there's a change. There's more stakeholders in the mix. It's a more complex fishery, and that complexity and those changes warrant a more sophisticated and up-to-date and transparent approach. And then lastly, there is wide-ranging ideas and wide-ranging support for strengthening the Commission. The folks that we talked to are not sitting back, unengaged, and not paying attention. On the contrary, people have a lot of ideas. There's a good deal of overlap on a number of the ideas, and as you would expect, there's also some divergence. And at this point, what we'd like to do is just walk through, again, these findings in greater detail, focusing first on the strengths, then on the challenges, and then coming back to the suggestions we heard from many of you.
All right, so turning to the strengths, as Bennett just said, there's a great deal of respect for the Commission, and it is widely praised for its skill at managing a sustainable fishery over a track record extending over many decades. There are effective practices that stretch back a very long way in time, and historically the Commission has really been an exemplar all over the world in science-based fishery management. There are a range of strengths that we think position the Commission to build on its past success, and one of them is a very strong analytic foundation supported by a rigorous science-based fisheries management approach. Without a doubt, that really stands out as one of the highlights of the Commission. There's also a robust research program. Topics around the area, around life history, fish movement, and electronic reporting stand out. The Research Advisory Board's guidance is an important forum and is viewed as a strength. And without a doubt, there is strong and active stakeholder participation, particularly at the annual meetings, as well as strong stakeholder staff interaction between meetings. So some of the other strengths that stand out: very active and engaged commissioners, skilled and experienced staff, which is broadly recognized for its commitment to work and its long track record and devotion to the work of the Commission. Some of the other strengths that stand out: the opportunity for focused commissioner-only deliberations. Several people pointed out improving ties with tribal and First Nations representatives, an effective budgeting process, the analytic foundation very much support the deliberations, and certainly we heard at the last annual meeting, and as you'll hear going forward, there are ongoing steps intended to adapt the process. So those are all important strengths that we saw. So at the same time, there are a number of challenges, and what I want to do is focus just for a moment on challenges, and we'll get into solutions later. The successes that we just highlighted are very much tempered by growing concerns about some of the structural factors that undermine the Commission's effectiveness, and they coalesce around a handful of primary concerns and observations. And I think those of you who attended the annual meeting probably heard some of these things. So in particular, there are growing doubts about the stock assessment model. From Canada, at least, there are concerns about the allocation methodology. There is certainly great interest in bycatch, in the issue of bycatch considerations, which is getting more attention. We have heard concerns that the assessment staff is somewhat resistant to getting input from outside voices. That may be changing, but that is one of the critiques we heard. We also heard that the survey doesn't address all areas with equal precision, which has implications for other analytic work. We also heard about concerns about the structure, and the comment was made, well, we have a 21st century fishery management set of problems, but we have a rather outdated structure to handle that. The stakeholder engagement process, as it stands now, while broadly inclusive, has some structural problems that limit effective participation. There are concerns about the breadth of Commission structure and the representation that permits. And there are also some concerns about the ad hoc nature of the Research Advisory Board. Part of our charge was to look broadly at best practices in fishery management and resource management. And what we see is that the IPHC approach is increasingly at odds with some of these best practices. In some of the areas where we found that the Commission's practices fall short, one is in transparency and Commission deliberation. Another is in the extent and frequency of peer review. A third in dialogue with stakeholders. And a fourth being the documentation, or actually the effort to write down and live by written guidelines or protocols. Some of the other challenges we noted, there is a lack of a long-term vision for a strategic plan and a long-term research plan. So those are current gaps. Roles and responsibilities. Commissioner vis-a-vis Commission staff need better specification. And there are also some tensions that are rooted in the binational structure of the Commission. There are a few gaps that are perceived in staffing. While tribal and First Nations interests have greater standing, and while the quality of the dialogue has improved, there's still a concern about having sufficient parity in the deliberations. And then the annual meeting structure and execution is yet another challenge. So it's a broad suite of challenges that we identified, and as you'll hear, we heard many suggestions, and from them we derived a set of recommendations. So then on to suggestions.
So what I'd like to do is walk through the key findings related to stakeholder suggestions. And again, I want to emphasize that these are suggestions we heard from the interviews. These are not our recommendations. We'll get to those in a minute. And a couple of points that we really want to emphasize here. I think, firstly, there were a number of suggestions that we heard that really cut across the range of perspectives and interest groups that we talked to. To be sure, there are specifics in any of these where there are divergent views, and we'll talk about those in a minute. But there are some important themes that emerged that we heard that are very important to highlight and we think provide a very strong foundation for the commissions moving forward. So the first thing we heard as far as stakeholder suggestions was great interest in improving transparency. There is a sense in many facets of the commission's work right now that that more of the commission's deliberation could be taking place in public, could be done in a more transparent fashion. And that ranges from the commission's annual meeting itself and the extent to which it is having meetings in administrative session versus public session, to the extent that the stock assessment model can be seen, can be tested, is transportable. Just a lot of areas where people felt the whole process could be opened up. And as one person said to us, everywhere else we're moving to public deliberations. And there's a sense from stakeholders who are familiar with all, many other settings that there needs to be more transparency here. A second area where there was a fairly strong cross-cutting theme was the need to strengthen the stakeholder engagement at annual meeting. The specifics of that, again, definitely divergent views, but with just about everyone we talked to, there was very much a desire for a consistent and meaningful commission stakeholder dialogue. People felt that there wasn't enough opportunity right now for exchange between those with an interest in the work of the commission and the commission itself. There was a sense that there needed to be clearer and more consistently applied guidelines for the conference board and the PAG. People wanted to have certainty in what that process looked like and be able to understand that, particularly for people who are new to the process. They felt there needed to be guidelines that people could look at it and understand. There was, but for sure, increased interest in the use of peer review of the stock assessment model. There was a sense of strong shared need for reviewing the model in the near term. Clearly, at the 2012 meeting, people were not comfortable with where that work was at, and as for those of you who attended the meeting, that was already an area that was beginning to move forward. Another area that garnered strong support from stakeholders was the development of a long-term research plan. People felt that the research program was solid, but they wanted to better understand how the research that is being undertaken corresponds and supports the objectives and addresses the issues that the Commission is wrestling with. Far and away, probably the strongest piece we heard was the need for greater clarity in the Commission process, roles and responsibilities. Very little is written down on paper right now that articulates what group does what kind of, what are they responsible for, how do they relate to each other, and there was a strong sense that everything from the PAG and the conference board to the Commission could benefit from more clearly articulated roles. Excuse me. Sorry, thank you. And finally, there was many strong suggestions that there needed to be greater leadership coming from the commissioners themselves. We heard that not only from stakeholders, but even from commissioners. There was a sense that this could be a better and stronger organization if it were more commission-driven. All of that said, as you might imagine, there were some very important nuances and distinctions in what we heard from stakeholders that are important to call out, and these are issues that Scott and I wrestled with in putting together our recommendations, and undoubtedly these are issues that the Commission will wrestle with as it considers what to do with the results from our performance review. So a couple to note. One, the extent to which the stakeholder process is revamped is an area where there were, frankly, a wide range of views. While everyone felt there was the need for greater clarity in how the stakeholder bodies work, there were, in fact, a range of views on should it be further evolved. And so some people felt, no, this is pretty close to the way we want it to be. It's good to have the conference board and the PAG deliberating separately. They have different interests and perspectives. Just clean up the roles, the responsibilities, and the process, and we're good to go. At the other end of the spectrum, there were people who felt This is not serving the Commission. We've got two distinct bodies. Their opinions are not integrated, and we are better off to create an entirely new body that has a standing membership and that can give the Commission integrated advice that draws from the range of harvesters and processors and interested stakeholders. Between those 2 points, there were various other options put forward, but there was quite a range in terms of what a new stakeholder process might look like. We heard a divergence of views on the frequency and the structure and the focus of peer review. Some people felt that it was important that there was annual peer review of the methodology as well as the output of the model itself. Others felt that might be overkill and that what you needed was some very near-term peer review, and after that perhaps you could have occasional peer review every 2 or 3 years or only after a significant change was made to the model. There were some who felt that it was essential that the commissions should be broadened, that in their view the number of stakeholders and the types of stakeholders who were in the mix these days is broader than when the commission was first constituted, and therefore the commission itself needed to be broadened and have perhaps through alternates bring in more voices on a permanent basis. Others, while acknowledging that change, felt that the commission as constituted with 3 on each side was good because it didn't in fact balkanize the commission into unique seats that were dedicated to each interest group, and that by having fewer commissioners it kind of forced the commission to grapple with those cross-interest issues, and to those folks there was a sense that better to keep it the way it is. Another area where folks had a range of views was on exactly how the staff should put forward recommendations to the commission. If you think about annual catch limits for a moment, there were some who felt that the current approach with staff putting forward a single recommendation was just as it should be. It kept the science front and center, and it minimized the potential for what some people would characterize as politics. Others felt that that was giving too much policy control to the commission, to the staff, and that staff really should be putting forward a range of options with associated risks, perhaps a staff recommendation and its rationale, but then it should be up to the commission to make a choice from among those policy options. So those were the flavor of suggestions that we got. So again, just in summary, lots of areas where there were a convergence of views, but some important distinctions that need to be considered as the commission goes forward.
So those stakeholder suggestions are very much one platform for our recommendations, but our recommendations are also informed by our look at best practices, and the recommendations are our synthesis. And really the set of 12 recommendations that we offer try to advance a set of principles that we think are very much in the spirit of current best practices, looking broadly at fishery management organizations. Those include fostering greater transparency, promoting informed decision-making, making sure that the process steps that the commission and commission deliberations proceed along are predictable, making sure that stakeholder input is both effective but also balanced, so quite an inclusive look at stakeholder input, taking advantage of the benefits of independent review and critiques, and making sure that decisions are not ad hoc but rather strategic, and strategic thinking supports and drives actions. And finally, and this is really the overarching goal, to strengthen the implementation of the overall treaty obligations. Now, obviously, we are in a time of tight budget constraints and scrutiny, and we recognize that all of these recommendations must be considered and, frankly, traded off and weighed in light of budgetary needs and priorities, and we are very mindful of that.
So at this point, what we'd like to do is walk through the 12 recommendations. We'll step through these fairly quickly because what we really want to do is create the time for you all to ask questions and hone in on the parts of the report that you may want to know more about. And let us know it, and we'll call it out as we go through it. Some of these recommendations that we're putting forward are already ideas that at the 2012 meeting gained a little traction, and so work is already beginning on some of these. It's really sort of the rhythm of the work we're doing relative to the 2012 meeting. So we'll point those places out as we walk through. So the first recommendation is to adopt clear and comprehensive protocols and rules of procedure. In a nutshell, our recommendation is really to update and expand and in some cases create rules of procedure for the Commission, for the Secretary, and for each current stakeholder body. So that's the PAG, the Conference Board, and the Research Advisory Board. And the rationale is really quite simple. Participants have little understanding of the Commission process right now. This ad hoc nature, it undermines the effectiveness, and in some cases, it diminishes the credibility of the process because people don't have a full understanding of exactly what's happening or why. The second recommendation is focused on improving Commission transparency. There are 3 specific recommendations associated with that. The first is to revise the annual meeting process so the Commission conducts the bulk of its deliberations in public. The second recommendation is that the Commission retain the option of executive session for limited activities. At a minimum, we would imagine that the Commission would want to retain the option for executive session for matters such as personnel, contractual, litigation issues. Commission may also wish to be conducting things like retreat and executive sessions, and it's our view that that's an appropriate activity and hence part of our recommendation. But to the extent that the Commission is meeting in camera, we certainly recommend that it produce summaries, not minutes, but synopses of discussions in a timely manner. So again, there is that transparency with the stakeholder community. Third recommendation is around revisiting the stakeholder engagement structure. This is a very challenging area, and we fully recognize that the current process that exists is well flawed. It's working, and in some ways it works extremely well, and to many it's a very effective process. But it's our sense that the current advisory process fails to effectively incorporate all elements of an expanding stakeholder base. The way it is constituted right now, not everyone has a seat at the table. It's ad hoc in nature, and it's very hard to know when a recommendation comes forward, what does it really mean and whose views does it reflect. So to that end, we are in essence recommending that by 2014, the Commission shift from 2 distinct bodies, a Conference Board and a RAB, into one integrated body that would bring together both processors and harvesters, and to the extent that there are other stakeholders that come to the mix, it would create an opportunity to broaden the table for them as well. We recommend that a body like that be comprised of about 20 to 24 people, which we think is broad enough to bring the wide range of interest to the table, but streamlined enough for that group to have a productive and focused conversation. We recognize, again, that this is a significant move, so we recommend that the Commission transition to this over a 2-year period, and that it do so with the advice and input of the stakeholder community. There needs to be buy-in to this approach. It needs to be effective and work, and we think the only way to do that is for the Commission to work with all of you as stakeholders to craft this approach. And in the meantime, we think the Commission should take some basic steps such as articulating how the PAG works, articulating how the Conference Board works in greater detail, and establishing a work team to help design what a more integrated body would look like.
Okay, the next 2 recommendations build on action items called out at the annual meeting. Recommendation 4 is to develop a strategic approach to research. The idea here is that to make sure that research projects are not just opportunistic or ad hoc, that they're really based upon a 5-year research plan that is very linked to the overall Commission objectives. Another one of our recommendations here is that the Research Advisory Board should be formalized, that its charge in terms of reference should be documented in a bit more detail. And the overall goal here is to make sure that research really is tethered to the most important needs of the Commission. The next recommendation is to strengthen the stock assessment model. And this would involve both annual and ongoing peer review of the stock assessment model as well as the associated apportionment process. Now, the exact details of how this needs to unfold need to be pinpointed in a little bit more with a little bit more specification. But we do believe that ongoing regular peer review should be part of the annual process. We also believe there should be a predictable process for going forward and considering changes to the assessment model and other related recommended actions. In order to make this possible, we think that it would be a very good idea to augment the existing Secretariat assessment staff, because peer review is a time-consuming activity. It really can't function without the full participation of the Commission assessment staff. And so in order to make this recommendation practical, this is one area where we believe the staff probably does need to be augmented. And globally, the goal here is to create a system where the stock assessment model is viewed as being more credible, more accessible and transparent, and more effective as a predictive tool.
Our sixth recommendation is to expand Commission composition. It's a recommendation that the Commission add up to 3 alternates each to both the U.S. side and the Canadian side, which would enable the interests that are not now adequately represented at the Commission. Additionally, a recommendation that there be put in place a rotation among both the permanent and alternate members, which we think would add legitimacy and also encourage integration across the different interests. We do not recommend exactly what the interests are that should be brought to the table, or whether that should be 1 alternate, 2 alternates, or 3 alternates. We think that is best left to the Commission to discuss and consider what makes the most sense.
So overall, we recognize that this set of recommendations amounts to quite a few changes. And to that end, we think that it would make sense to create an overall long-term strategic plan, really to create a template to better coordinate and streamline the Commission efforts. We think this plan needs to have a set of specific milestones and performance measures so as to be able to establish and then track progress. We also think this would very much be helpful in helping to deal with tight budget times and mesh with Commission overall budgeting. So the next point really flows from some of the concerns that we heard about roles and responsibilities relative to Commissioners and Commission staff, and also concerns about stock assessment. And it's our feeling that there ought to be a stronger boundary or delineation between scientific analysis and policy options. It's our recommendation that analytic functions, while they are very appropriately a staff role, there is too often a tendency for Commission staff to venture into policy deliberation and policy delineation. And so while we think that sort of background research is important and helpful, we recommend that policy options be called out as such, and that there be a strong distinction between scientific analysis and policy options. And we think, in particular, this has a bearing relative to catch limits. We recommend that on the issue of catch limits, that staff provide Commission with not just one, but a range of options and forecast associated risks and benefits of each option. So this is both about the delineation between science and policy. It's also on the delineation of roles, Commissioners vis-a-vis staff.
Our recommendation number 9 is to provide greater leadership at the Commissioner level. Responding to many of the comments we heard on our own observations, we think the Commission would benefit from the Commissioners taking a more active role in articulating and implementing a vision for the Commission. We think that the Commission would benefit from clearer guidance to the Commission executive staffs on its functions, on the actions it's taking, as Scott just said a moment ago, on its priorities. And we think that there's an opportunity for the Commission to exercise and model a stance of principled negotiation, by which we mean really talking about what your interests are. And so from the U.S. and the Canadian Commissioners talking about what are the interests they're trying to solve, and then working to integrate them at and around the table.
So the next recommendation pertains to elevating the importance of tribes and First Nations, and we certainly acknowledge this is a challenging issue to deal with because each nation has its own procedures and arrangements. But we see 2 areas where where the importance of tribes and First Nations can be elevated. One is in the possibility of having a seat, if there is a creation of an additional seat as an alternate, to create that as an opportunity for tribal and First Nation voices to be heard at the commissioner table. The second area where we see real possibilities is to actively engage tribal and First Nation scientists in structured peer reviews and to really call out their role and access in any terms of reference for a peer review process.
Recommendation 11 centers on strategies for strengthening the interim and annual meeting process. We heard a lot of ideas in this area, and our review includes some very specific recommendations. A few that we'll call out today are adding a third science and research-focused meeting to the annual meeting cycle. We believe that that would, one, create a platform for more focused conversations on these important issues, and two, relieve some of the pressure on what's now the January annual meeting to focus much more on cat shares and create space for a conversation with stakeholders. We think that the meeting could benefit from stronger internal meeting preparation, presentations that are clear and targeted at a level that will be accessible to the wide range of stakeholders who are in attendance. We think there's more opportunity to take advantage of webinars. And finally, increasing opportunities for public comment. Very importantly, we're recommending that the meeting be created and be shaped in a way that allows for more interaction between the commissioners and stakeholders and more opportunity for public comment.
So obviously communication goes hand in hand with transparency and inclusion. And we see 3 or 4 steps that the Commission could take. One is in increasing the timeliness and use of meeting summaries, turning them around more quickly, making them more accessible. The second is creating policies to guide staff comments on fishery management policies under consideration before other bodies. And a third is to try different forms of outreach to non-traditional stakeholder groups that have an interest in the Commission's work. So that collectively is our set of 12 recommendations. If you look at the report in detail, there are numbers of more specific recommendations under each broad heading. And obviously, this is a lot of food for thought. We believe these recommendations are mutually reinforcing. They are interrelated. Some of them have very strong linkages one to another. Some are more complex than others. So moving forward from here, this rollout really marks the end of our work on this performance review. So we suggest that the Commission accept our report. We don't mean endorse the report, but accept it as in receiving it. And we further suggest that this rollout that we're doing right now mark the beginning of a public comment period. And as you'll hear, that is exactly, I think, what the intent is going forward. We think that public comment on the report will be very important in shaping the Commission response and in designing a strategy going forward. And I believe we will hear and talk a little bit more about that as we go through the balance of the meeting. So that really concludes our presentation on the performance review and our recommendations in particular. And at this point, I believe we'd like to entertain clarifying questions.
That's right. Thanks, Scott and Bennett. Very well done. I think that was very helpful as a good overview of the report. Turning to the webinar logistics, for those of you who may have joined a little late, I wanted to reiterate that you are now able to submit questions via the website. I and my Canadian colleague Allison Webb will be looking at those as they come in. We already have at least one that's been submitted. We'll be reading those out loud, so those of you listening in can hear what the question is. As I said a moment ago, others of your colleagues who are on the website cannot see the questions you're submitting. That's why we're paraphrasing them. As a side note, I'd like to mention that this is the first time the Commission has entered into this process of a two-way webinar. Many of you may know from the December meetings in the past, we've had one-way webinars where you're able to hear the results and the findings from the staff and hear the discussion among the commissioners. So we're sort of feeling ourselves out here, trying to understand how this works. It is a first step among many, I think, toward improved transparency and greater engagement with the stakeholders. There are IPHC staff members who are monitoring the questions that are coming in. Those of you who have technical questions about how the website's working, just go ahead and feel free to submit those. We'll try to get to those as quickly as we can. In case it hasn't been said already, I wanted to let folks know that the commissioners really didn't see this report much earlier than you did. And so they, too, are trying to assimilate what the findings are. They, too, are trying to digest the findings from CONCUR. And you may, in fact, hear questions from them as we proceed. Having said that, I'll turn it over to Allison, who can sort of work on our first question here.
Thanks, John. It's Allison Webb from the Department of Fisheries and Oceans. Just to reinforce the point that John had made earlier, too, and for those people who just recently joined, these questions are really focused on areas where there's lack of clarity in the report, and you would like to hear from the consultant team from CONCUR further details about those areas where it isn't as clear to you as it might be. That would be the main purpose of these discussions, and you also might have some questions around methodology. And as they mentioned, today will be the end of their contract, so this is a very good opportunity to hear from them specifically about some of those things. In terms of comments around the recommendations themselves and your various views, that will be done through the public comment period. So you shouldn't be concerned that you have to put all of those concerns or opinions or views that you have in writing for today, but rather just focus on clarification and any information that the consultant team could give you around methodology and things like that. You will have quite a few days in order where you can actually look at the report, assess that, talk to any of your colleagues that you need to, and provide things back in terms of written feedback. And as John mentioned, the commissioners will be in the same boat as you in terms of digesting the results of this. So I have the first question here that's been submitted so far, and as John mentioned, we're working our way through this. We've never done this before. The first question speaks to what was just mentioned by CONCUR at the end about a lot of these recommendations have linkages to each other, and there's questions around sequencing and what is done first. So perhaps, Scott and Bennett, you could provide some more of your thoughts around this specific question, which is you talked in one of your recommendations, I believe it was the first recommendations, about creating terms of reference for each subsidiary body, including the PAG and the conference board. But in a later recommendation, you are recommending the merger of those two subsidiary bodies. So the question is, would it be necessary to make a decision on the structure of the stakeholder engagement process first before doing the work around the clear terms of reference for subsidiary bodies so as not to duplicate effort?
Excellent question. I have a few ideas. Bennett, do you want to start? Okay. So as you see, the recommendation actually steps out a four-step process, and the first one of which is actually to create clarity, greater clarity around these two bodies. So even if a decision were made not to create the unified stakeholder body that we recommend, the notion of creating greater clarity for the two bodies on their own, I think, would stand on its own, and our recommendation is that that move forward in advance of the next annual meeting.
Yeah, I would just add to that that there's a recognition that the stakeholder advisory process that's in place right now really is befuddling to many, and since we don't imagine that the Commission would be shifting to something new or different for, at a minimum, for 2 annual meeting cycles, that in the near term, maybe a triage of articulating the current rules and procedures would be beneficial. I think I would agree with the caller that you want to minimize the amount of effort you're putting into the rewrite now, but it does seem like some clarity is helpful and necessary in the short term.
Okay. Looks like we just had a second question come in just a moment ago. Why don't you go ahead? I can barely read.
Okay, thank you. The second question is you mentioned specifically, again, this is a bit of a sequencing question and the linkage between a couple of the different recommendations, so some clarification around that. You mentioned the danger of balkanizing the Commission by providing seats that represent certain sectors of the stakeholders, yet you recommend adding seats to the Commission to represent those sectors who you say don't currently have a place at the table. So how do you have one without the other?
Fair question,
Yes.
and that gets to our recommendation that you have a rotation among those that have a full seat versus an alternate seat. And so our thinking is that by having alternating seats, it encourages the Commission members who will to work together to integrate their interests, because in fact there would only be 3 voting members at any time, and so it would be in the interest of all the Commissioners to be working together. We further strongly recommend, and we didn't highlight this in our presentation, but it calls in the report for using selection criteria for Commissioners in populating it with people who are experienced and skilled at integrating interests other than whatever their unique interest group is from. And that's fundamental to making a Commission that works and doesn't center on individual interests. Scott, you care to add anything?
Well, I would just say that what we're trying to do here is to achieve 2 objectives. One is integration, and the second is diversity of voices. And as we said in our presentation, there are many more voices interested in the International Pacific Halibut Commission than there were when it was created. And we want to come to grips with that reality of the more complex policy world that we find ourselves in and create opportunities for those voices to be at the table. At the same time, we don't think there should just be seats that are identified with single narrow interests. All of the seats should be occupied by people who are in fact committed to integration.
Thanks, Scott and Bennett. The next question speaks to, well, it just quite plainly asks, what were the specific examples or issues where the Commission showed a lack of leadership?
Well, I think this is complex. One of the quotes that I believe appears in our report was something to the effect that, well, we the Commission, should have seen this problem with declining catch at age and come to grips with it sooner than we did. Another comment that we heard was that, sorry, is it okay? Is the technology working? Right. Another comment that we heard was that there has been, by custom and habit over the last dozen years or so, kind of a vacuum on the part of leadership being exerted by Commissioners, and so quite naturally senior staff have stepped into it, and to some extent both Commissioners and staff have become too accustomed to that norm. So that it's more than a specific example. I think that's just sort of a pattern that several people alluded to that we heard about in our interviews. Bennett, do you have another example or two?
Well, a couple of areas where people cited that. First of all, there was just a general, we heard a very strong general call for a more commissioner-led commission that ramified in specifics such as the Commissioners should have a stronger voice in research priorities, and there should be discussions around what is our long-term research vision and how does that fit in with where we're trying to go as a Commission. We heard it in the context of the Commissioner should be pressing more aggressively for peer review. So there are a number of different ways that in the interviews people talked about a stronger Commissioner-led commission.
I think that the other dimension of this, and we allude to this in our recommendations, is just the nature of the dialogue among Commissioners and what's disclosed in public session. And a lot of the decisions that Commissioners make are not transparent. They're not, the logic of the decisions is not apparent to the stakeholders because a lot of the discussions don't take place in public, and the trade-offs that are very real that Commissioners need to make are not explained. And so that's not exactly the same as leadership, but it's modeling a stance as we refer to it, of principled negotiation. And we think that is a form of exercising leadership, and that there are opportunities to do more of that.
Thank you. The next question is related to your recommendation about alternates. Is it possible to achieve a change like that, inclusion of alternates, without an amendment to the treaty? Any views you have with respect to that?
Well, I would say that of the 43 people we interviewed, maybe 1 or 2 called for amending the treaty. And we are not experts in the treaty procedures. The very strong implication that we took is that if there are ways of accomplishing this without treaty amendment, that would gain much more support, and we ourselves are not recommending amendments to the treaty.
Okay. This is John. I can speak a little bit to the U.S. Domestic implementing legislation for the treaty, the Pacific Halibut Act 1982, which does contemplate alternate commissioners being seated, but it's fairly prescriptive. It limits, right now, it limits the designation of alternates only to those meetings where the full commissioners, for lack of a better word, commissioners are not going to be present. Mm-hmm. And so it doesn't contemplate sort of parallel seats there. It doesn't, laws are not set in stone. They can be changed, but that's my current understanding of reading of the Halibut Act in the U.S. I don't think we have any more questions for the time being. We'll keep an eye on the screen. Oh, looks like we just had one sent in. That's a long one. I'll let Allison take a crack at paraphrasing it.
Okay, this next question is asking about the delineation between scientific analysis and policy options, and about that recommendation specifically. And the question is, does your recommendation to strengthen delineation between scientific analysis and policy options include in strengthening the separation temporally? For example, does the recommendation include public or commission review of the proposed changes to harvest policy prior to including that policy in science-based catch limits on a separate track?
Good question. I would say we have heard about and documented a pattern of very abrupt introduction of staff recommendations and then the need for very quick commissioner decisions. And logically, some amount of time needs to pass between teeing up and framing an issue, which is really the first step in policy analysis, naming an issue, then conducting the analysis, identifying the options, and then drawing the conclusions or reaching the preferred recommendation. And what we try to do in our report is say those 4 steps really need to be identified and respected and followed, as opposed to conflating them and compressing them together. And so logically, that would require a little bit more time.
And I would just refer people to, if they have the full report, if you look at recommendation number 5, it includes language specifically around the Commission using a more articulated timeline for developing proposed policy changes, so that there is an opportunity for people to be aware of a change, have a dialogue with the stakeholder community, and then actually have moved to Commission action.
Okay, this is John again. We do not have any other questions coming in for the time being. Michael Pearson.
Since you opened the door to commissioners asking questions too.
Of course.
I have one. In the analysis, there is several references or section where you talk about cross-cutting, particularly from the stakeholders, cross-cutting ideas or the ones that reinforced, I guess. Right. Based on that, I noticed that the 12 recommendations don't give any you don't make any kind of suggestions regarding which could be implemented or should be implemented or more significant from the standpoint of stakeholders that should be implemented in the near term, i.e. within the next year, as opposed to it might take longer. There's a couple I know that you make a specific reference, for example, on this whole question of possibility of bringing the different stakeholder groups together. You talk about this 2-year time frame. But in other ways, in many of the recommendations, you don't suggest that one should be done sooner than another. And some of that can be inferred potentially, but I'd be curious about it based on what you know to have been the things that dominated some of the stakeholder commentary or some of your interview commentary, I should say. Maybe make it more than the stakeholders, all of it at least. Would you highlight or suggest that when you look at the 12 recommendations that it might be a couple that jumped out at you based on the cross-cutting analysis that you would think would be ones that there was a real consensus that urgent action would be necessary or is desirable of the 12?
Well, a couple occur to me, and Bennett, you can weigh in a second here. Certainly the recommendations around transparency generated a huge amount of support. I would say that was pretty unambiguous. And I believe there are steps that can be taken around that would apply at the next annual meeting. So, that seems to be one. I mean, I'm not suggesting that it's completely simple or easy, but that could be implemented in the relatively near term. Some of the recommendations about commission procedure, I think, could be implemented in the near term. Some of the recommendations around communication. And in terms of cross-cutting support, there's very strong support for peer review, and there's already some work underway about how to think about and move on that issue. I think the stakeholder engagement process, the rounding out the composition of the commission itself, those are more complex, and they did not generate monolithic support. There were different ideas, as Bennett called it, nuanced ideas. Anyway, that's an initial comment on that.
Yeah, I think that captures it well. I think the other one I would throw in is there are many specific steps that could be taken to strengthen the meeting process that are pretty clear-cut, pretty broadly supported, and I think fairly easy to implement.
Or at least straightforward.
Are there any other questions from Commissioner Spillett?
Yeah, I forgot which recommendation number it is, but you recommend creating one unified stakeholder body.
Yes, recommendation number 3.
And well, we got the commercial fishermen, and then we got the recreational fishermen, subsistence fishermen, and tribal fishermen, U.S. fishermen, Canadian fishermen. Any ideas on how to make up the 20 to 24 people based on how many commercial fishermen versus sport?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are kind of two dimensions to this. One is, what are the ratios? What's the right ratio? Another is, what are the objective criteria that you want to look at for appointing representatives to this kind of a body? And I think on the second point, the same concept that we mentioned with regard to commissioners, you want people that are capable of integrating multiple points of view and are not only advocates for one narrow constituency. To give an example, and I don't know that this is a perfect example, Bennett and I facilitate many take reduction teams, which are multi-stakeholder groups that are charged with developing regulations to avoid accidental bycatch of marine mammals and turtles in commercial fishing. And these take reduction teams, some of them embrace a very large geographic area, for example, the entire east coast of the United States. And they include the same kinds of groups, although they also include the conservation community and the scientific community. So choices have to be made, and there are representatives from a range of commercial fisheries that sit on these bodies. And in that case, there's an appointment process, but there could be a nomination process. So I guess we don't have the perfect answer for exactly how this would be done, but we know of and work with many analogous situations. In terms of the ratio, I think that if your goal is broad-based support or something approaching consensus, then you don't need exact numerical parity, because the decision rule is more striving for consensus and less taking votes. And this is in contrast to how we understand the conference board works now, is by taking votes. So if you change the decision rules and you change the method of composition, you give yourself a little more flexibility in how you compose a group like this. So that's kind of a long-winded answer, but Bennett, do you have more ideas to add?
I would just add that we went through an exercise of trying to populate something like a 20 to 24 person integrated body, and we felt that those were sufficient numbers to capture the range of perspectives across both nations. We did not go further in prescribing what that should look like, because we really believe that that's a process that the Commission itself has to undertake with the input from the stakeholders. I don't think we would make the case that we should impose that, but we feel quite comfortable that a body the size of 24 stakeholders or so would be robust enough to bring all the interests to the table.
Okay, thanks for that. There is one more question that's come in via the website. It sets the scene in terms of bycatch and other fisheries, and even in the longline fishery itself being a significant issue. And it asks, do any of your recommendations address the problem of halibut bycatch and wastage in other fisheries or the longline fishery itself?
I would say that we certainly heard a stakeholder suggestion that bycatch should be elevated as an issue that deserves more attention. We did not craft a specific recommendation around that. I think that it probably links up with, well, it is mentioned in Recommendation 12 on improved communications, the concerns regarding bycatch on page 64. So it's mentioned there. It certainly has an intersection with the research agenda, with the strategic plan recommendation, and with the assessment methodology. So obliquely, we refer to bycatch, but we don't have a specific recommendation on bycatch. And this is not to say that we don't think it's a very important issue. We just did not make a specific recommendation about it.
Okay. Well, as folks out there in the ether continue to consider questions to turn in, this seems like a good time to turn it over to the commissioners for their summary thoughts and maybe a description of next steps in the process. And when you folks are done with that, if there are other questions that have come in, we'll touch on those.
Okay, thanks, John. I'm Michael Pearson here. I'll make a comment first, and then my colleague Jim can add, and the other commissioners as well. I think the first thing I'd like to say on behalf of the Canadian commissioners, and indeed on behalf of Canada overall, is to thank CONCUR for this work. It's been very helpful, very instructive, very informative. I think there's always value in having our own peer review, perhaps we could call it in a way, of the Commission, given that it has been operating for such a long time. And I think that one of the things that really struck me in my initial reading of their report was the very valuable balance you put, either purposely or not, between highlighting strengths and highlighting challenges. Because I think as obviously you were able to reflect a strong view among many that there's many good aspects of the IPHC and how it works, and that what isn't broken in that sense shouldn't be artificially fixed. And yet at the same time, for all kinds of good reasons that you described, there are a number of valuable challenges that should be looked at as a way to improve what is already an institution that has got an important and valuable and credible track record. So thank you again for the work that you've done in that regard. I do want to echo comment that John made at the beginning regarding this work as being consistent with a more general international trend to review and strengthen international fish management organizations. I think this is a very important development internationally, and I've certainly had direct experience with some of that work in a few other commissions, both on the Pacific coast and on the Atlantic area and beyond. And I think what is important is that in all cases there is a recognition that there are some things that work well and other things that need to be improved, and that we need to catch up, I think, as you highlight, or you say some of your interviewees highlight, with 21st century practices in some cases. And indeed, I would put it in a little bit different way, but the same concept of to try to understand how we can develop international best practices or reflect international best practices in our own work at this commission. I think that's something that both countries are, particularly given how engaged we are in many international fish management organizations, how committed we are to that. And I know that Bruce and his team are equally committed to learning and to reflecting best practices in the work of the Commission. So thank you for highlighting that. You, in answer to the question I had and others had, I think I do want to reiterate the point that you made about the importance that a lot of the interviewees attach to transparency and communication. And I think this is something, this webinar is a reflection in part of the interest and commitment. I think it would be safe to say, I could argue, is a unanimous view amongst commissioners. And I think one of the things we will definitely, in looking at things that we could possibly implement in the near future, i.e. within a year or even less than that, those may be some of the areas where a substantial response and in fact changes could occur. So I'm looking forward to further discussions about that and some results coming out of that. Last thing I'll say is, I think the experience that we've had with the report here is really going to be just the beginning of an ongoing opportunity that we should exercise in this commission to constantly review what we do and look for ways of improving it. This will be a very important milestone, and I think the decisions that will be made over the next several months and years in response to the recommendations will be obviously a key to that. But I don't think that we should assume that this is just a blip in time where we look at recommendations, we make decisions on them, and then we go on for another 80 years before we think again. There is obviously a real value in a constant peer review, if you want to call it that, which we talked about wanting to have anyway for the science purposes. But that as an organization, we see ourselves as constantly open to peer review and ways of improving. There was a question asked, and I can start, and Jim and others can add about what's next. I think it was highlighted by Alison and John at the beginning. This is really the first step of the analysis of the recommendations, commentary on the recommendations. We have this period up until June 30th for further comments by anyone who is interested in providing that. Commissioners will also, obviously during that time period, and governments and the Commission and its staff will be looking at the recommendations more closely. We anticipate a period of time over the summer to roll up the various comments that are made by everyone who has provided them. And that will lead to a focused executive session. There will be, sorry to say, not too many, but an executive session in the fall. Early fall, the commissioners will have a chance, working with the commission staff, to review the added comments. And I want to emphasize, of course, that this report is all about a whole series of comments that have been given to you from many stakeholders, and there will be another chance for stakeholders to comment on those comments, and then a further opportunity over the summer and into the fall for those comments to be comprehensively reviewed and thought through by commissioners, and then on that basis for some decision making to start happening. I mean, like it is in other processes with other reviews of international commissions, there is a period of time where the contracting parties have the responsibility for making to have a considered review and decision about what to do with any recommendation, all recommendations. And it is our hope and wish and expectation that through the fall and then leading into and at the interim meeting and at the annual meeting next January in Victoria, that the commissioners will be in a position to provide substantive and clear replies to all the recommendations. Doesn't mean that all recommendations would either be accepted or would be implemented at any specific moment. We talked earlier about some lending themselves more to early or quick potential decision than others, but certainly a comprehensive set of responses to all, so that there is a clear, back to the point about transparency and communication, a clear sense on behalf of all concerned that they know where the Commission stands with respect to the ideas that have been put forward, and we'll know that within, no later than the outcomes or the annual meeting itself, with the understanding that there's obviously an ongoing process of implementation after that. So I'll leave it there and pass it over to my colleague Jim.
Thank you, Michael. That was a good summary, and so I don't feel the need to add a whole lot. Thanks to CONCUR, I think that was a very useful report. Sort of on behalf of the old-time commissioners that have been around for a while, and I don't think we were very surprised by any of the recommendations that were in this report. And in fact, as we mentioned at the beginning by Mr. Field and others, several of these recommendations have already been accepted by the Commissioner and has been work done on them. So these are things that we recognize need to be done, and I find it heartening that you picked up on those and included those, so at least we feel we've started in the right direction on those. It's kind of a vehicle for us to continue with. It's a good structure for us to go forward with. On the transparency thing issue, which to me is the most important thing that comes out of here, the commission that started in 2009, I think John Field said, to look at this performance review. And we actually made some fairly significant progress. We've been using webinars to go at the interim meetings and other times to get the information out to the public. But we started in 2009 on the performance review, so rather than going to fully transparent meetings, we might have made it by now had we not been waiting for this report. So we did wait for this, and so I'm really pleased to see that recommendation is in there. I think I'm glad that you included the fact that this commission has managed the halibut resource sustainably for 80 years. We obviously have some problems now, and even in your report largely on processes here, I was pleased to see that you picked up some biological information. The dramatic increase in size early in the century, last century I guess, well let me say that again, mid-last century, and then the change back to very apparently slow growth. So that is actually a background behind a lot of these things, and I'm pleased to see that you didn't stay away from that. So all in all, I think it was a great report. I'll just have to say, I suppose, since this is on the web now, that I agree with everything, but I don't think I can ever Twitter.
Well spoken as an old-time commissioner. Can I ask either Philip or, I don't know, is Ralph still with us? We lost him. Philip, do you want to add anything further?
Well, a couple things. This has got a lot of work ahead to revamp the whole IPHC process. On the one hand, it seems like a burden and a lot of work to do, but on the other hand, if you take it one step at a time, I think it's a real good working document to improve the IPHC process, and hopefully, from the science to the decision making on the annual catch limits. I'm glad that they're looking at peer review of the science, much like the North Pacific Council has peer review of the science. And as a commissioner, you know, I was raising the concern or questions earlier about a commissioner like me didn't re-up for the next round, and the U.S. side is had a nomination process. So if there's any questions out there from the stakeholders, you know, I'm still wondering how a commissioner on my way out here fits in, whether I mean, I'm here because of my fiduciary obligations, but on the other hand, maybe there might be a new commissioner sitting here taking my place when a lot of this gets going. So, but I'll be out there with the stakeholders next.
With your views being equally important even at that time, and indeed it's in the spirit of that, just before I turn it back to you, John and Allison, that I'll ask my colleague Laura if she has a few comments to make. You talked about her being, you know, recently retired. Of course, it'd be nice to say that from government kind of thing,
yes,
but
no, I know that wasn't the case.
That's definitely not the case. And certainly, even though she's recently stepped down as commissioner, I specifically and Jim graciously supported me in ensuring that she could come to our discussion today as a recently former commissioner with a lot of important and strong views and an ongoing important role to play in the work of the commission. So, Laura, comment from you.
Yeah, well, thanks very much for that introduction. And again, I just want to acknowledge the work that Scott and Bennett did in putting together this report. I think there are a lot of very useful commentary in here. I certainly appreciated the thoroughness of the representation of the different views and the challenges and really the successes that we can build on and the challenges that we have ahead. There's certainly a lot of meat in this report that is going to take some time to think about. You know, as was just said, we just got this report ourselves, so we haven't had very much time to really think about it or react to it, and I'm sure we will have and want to have more reaction to that over the next while. And I certainly, speaking on behalf of DFO, I know that we are very committed to be working collegially forward in this. I think we want to see some successes come out of this, and we want to make sure that the Commission continues to be one of the best in the world. And I think we've got some good material here to ensure that we can continue that high quality that we've seen far into the future. So I'm looking forward to hearing what the new commissioners all do to move this agenda forward.
Thanks, Michael. Before I turn it over to Allison, I just wanted to reiterate the point that I tried to make early in the webinar, and that is that this is not the end of hearing stakeholder input. It's not the end of a public input process. It's really just the beginning. As folks have more time to read the report, have more time to consider how it impacts them and their constituency, I urge you to use the website portal to turn in your comments. Be as specific or as general as you want. The IPHC staff here in Seattle will be working with Allison and myself as the two standing members of the Review Steering Committee to collate those over the summer and turn in sort of a comprehensive report and analysis of those public comments for a commissioner retreat in September. There will be instructions on the website on how to submit your comments. There will also be a press release going out shortly after today to summarize what we've talked about. And I do encourage you to pass this web link on to your colleagues, to others in the industry who have an interest in this, who may not have had a chance to participate today. There's no limit on who should really see this report and weigh in on it. With that, I'll turn it over to Allison.
Thanks, John. Just before I make a final comment, there is another question that has arisen, and I'll just take the opportunity to say that after CONCUR answers this question, we'll be closing it off. So if you have any other ones, submit them as soon as possible. So I'll pose this question to CONCUR, and then I can provide any comments after that. So the question is, does the Commission have a conflict of interest policy? And in the interviews that you conducted or any observations you had, were there any perceived issues of conflict of interest?
Interesting question. I don't know about the conflict of interest policy per se. I will say that this is not a conflict, but I will say that there was a periodic concern expressed that commercial interests have a very strong voice at the Commission table, which is, I don't think, in any way a conflict. It's a recognition of the importance, economic stake, and political reality that we live in. I don't think that rises to the level of a conflict. I can't actually think of a direct point around conflict of interest. Can you? In any of the interviews that we did?
I'm trying to think of what there are that were mentioned. I'm not thinking of any offhand, but without going over all 43 interview notes, I wouldn't want to say definitively not. But I don't think of any of
Allison, honestly, I think if someone had called that out in a very direct way, I don't think we would have skated over it in our report. So, not aware of it.
This is John. The only other bit that I would offer on conflict of interest is that in the United States anyway, the implementing legislation speaks to the very general criteria for our commissioners, and those include knowledge and experience in the Pacific halibut fishery. So while some might view that as a conflict of interest, there is certainly an intent of our Congress to make sure that people who were involved in the fishery were also seated as commissioners, or at least who had knowledge of conservation and fisheries surrounding Pacific halibut were seated as commissioners. And that's true for other international fisheries organizations we belong to. There's an intent to get industry perspectives at the table.
I guess I would just add, borrowing what you said, if there was anything, it was really along the lines of recognition in some of these comments that this is a very tight-knit group, that there are associations and affiliations that some may feel that it's a perception of bias or a perception of too close, but I don't think we heard of any direct conflicts of interest.
Okay. Thank you. There is one last question, which is just a clarification question about where the comments would be sent. And just to clarify that, if today you were able to, or previously, to sign on to the webinar through the IPHC website, and there's a dedicated page to the performance review itself, and that's where you should go to get further information about submitting comments.
Should be up within a day or two.
And that should be available within the next day or two, so you can just keep an eye out for that. Those are all the last questions that we have. The only other comment I wanted to make before we close is just that there was a question specifically about bycatch and the importance of that, and we certainly heard that across the board at the annual meeting in Anchorage. And we had some actions that were approved in the context of the annual meeting, both on bycatch, but as well as on some of the science-related issues. And I just wanted to be sure that people understood that there are actions already ongoing and follow-up work that's been taking place and is taking place with respect to those two key areas that there was very broad support on. And the work of the performance review does not mean that that work is not going to continue to take place, but the performance review is mutually reinforcing to a lot of those initiatives. So that's something I just wanted to clarify, because you may have heard that there's been some meetings in those regard, and I didn't want to, I wanted to underscore the importance that was attached to the initiatives around the bycatch, as well as the peer review, stock assessment, etc. With that, I would also like to give my thanks to CONCUR and to my colleague John Field. It's been a very interesting project to work on that we've got to this point in time, and this again is just the beginning, so looking forward to continuing to work on it. I also wanted to express my thanks to all of the people that generously gave their time to provide their views. There's a lot of investment in the process and making it work, and the reason that, part of the reason that the results of this report are so good is because of the richness and the feedback that was provided by many people sitting in this room right now, but as well as a lot of the people that are on the webinar, so thank you for that. And we look forward to continuing to work with you as we roll this out and give due consideration to all of the information that is contained within the report.
Okay, so with that, I will draw the webinar to a close, also echoing Allison's and others' appreciation to Scott and Bennett. I think it has been a great experience for the Halibut Commission, certainly me professionally. I think at the end of the day, we all hope and expect that this will make the Halibut Commission an even better forum for Canada and the U.S. to work out their mutual concerns in the fishery. Allison and I will look for your comments via the website, and we'll be back in touch as the process unfolds.